Picture this. It's December 25th, 1991, and you're watching something that was supposed to be impossible. The Soviet Union, one of the world's two superpowers, a nuclear-armed empire that had dominated half the planet for 7 decades, is dissolving before your eyes. The hammer and sickle flag is being lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. Mikhail Gorbachev is resigning, and the entire communist system that controlled a sixth of the Earth's landmass is simply ending. Most people think the Soviet Union collapsed because of communism's failures, or Reagan's military buildup, or Gorbachev's political reforms. And while those factors played roles, they're missing the real story. The Soviet Union didn't collapse simply because of ideology or politics. It collapsed because of debt. It collapsed because of oil, and it collapsed because of the exact same financial death spiral that has destroyed every empire in history. And here's what should terrify every American. The United States is following the exact same playbook. Hey, I'm Brandon, and welcome back to My Money Mint, the channel where I dive into topics related to money and wealth. All right, let's get into it. In 1970, the Soviet Union owed Western banks about $1.8 billion in external debt. That's relatively small, manageable for a superpower economy. By 1980, just 10 years later, that debt had exploded to $17.8 billion, a tenfold increase in a single decade. By the late 1980s, the USSR owed over $31 billion to Western creditors, and when you included all of Eastern Europe, the communist bloc owed $65.4 billion to Western commercial banks. Now, those numbers might not sound huge by today's standards, but here's what made Soviet debt uniquely dangerous. Unlike the United States, which can print dollars that the world is forced to accept, the Soviet Union had to earn hard currency, dollars and Western European currencies, to service their debt. And they could only get that hard currency one way, by selling oil and natural gas to the West. The Soviet economy was a petrostate disguised as a superpower, and when oil prices collapsed in the 1980s, the entire house of cards came crashing down. Let me take you back to the 1970s and show you how this death spiral began. After the 1973 oil embargo, global oil prices quadrupled almost overnight. This was catastrophic for most Western economies, but it was a windfall for the Soviet Union. As one of the world's top oil producers, the USSR suddenly found itself swimming in hard currency. Oil exports that had brought in modest amounts were now generating massive revenue streams. The Soviets discovered massive oil fields in western Siberia with recoverable reserves exceeding 300 million tons, some of the most productive oil deposits ever found. And Western banks were eager to lend to them. The Soviets were seen as first-class borrowers because their centralized control over export revenue seemed like perfect security. Plus, banks were flush with petrodollars from Middle Eastern countries and needed places to invest. So the Soviets started borrowing heavily from banks in London, Frankfurt, Vienna, Paris, and Luxembourg. They used this borrowed money to do what communist economies couldn't do efficiently: buy food and consumer goods from the West. Because here's the dirty secret about the Soviet economy. Despite controlling vast agricultural land and having a massive population, they couldn't feed their own people. Soviet agriculture was so catastrophically inefficient that they had to import grain from the West just to avoid famine. They also needed Western capital goods, machinery and technology that Soviet industry simply couldn't produce at competitive quality levels. The more they borrowed, the more dependent they became on continuing to borrow. But in the 1970s, with oil prices high, this seemed sustainable. The hard currency from oil sales could easily cover debt service and import needs. Western bankers assumed this would continue indefinitely. They were catastrophically wrong. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was hemorrhaging money on military spending and Cold War commitments that they simply couldn't afford. Estimates put Soviet military spending at between 10% and 20% of GDP. Though exact figures were impossible to determine because the Soviet system deliberately obscured military costs across multiple ministries. Even the Soviets themselves probably didn't know the true total. But here's what we do know. Military spending continued regardless of overall economic conditions. When the economy was growing, military got its funding. When the economy was stagnating, military still got its funding. Nothing else had that priority. The best Soviet scientists and engineers were diverted to military research instead of civilian applications. The most advanced technology went to defense, not to improving people's lives. The entire economy was organized around military capability rather than economic efficiency. And then came Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, beginning what would become their Vietnam, a decade long quagmire that drained resources, killed thousands of Soviet soldiers, and accomplished absolutely nothing except demonstrating Soviet weakness. The Afghanistan war came at the worst possible time. Just as oil revenues were about to collapse, the Soviets committed themselves to an expensive military adventure that required hard currency to sustain. But the military spending wasn't even the biggest drain. By 1985, the Soviet Union was spending $6.9 billion per year supporting communist client states around the world. 85% of that money went to just three countries: Cuba, Mongolia, and Vietnam. Think about that. The Soviet economy was struggling to feed its own people, but they were sending billions to prop up failed communist regimes on other continents. And these client states weren't even grateful. By the late 1980s, many were opening trade discussions with the West despite receiving massive Soviet subsidies. The Soviets were paying billions for allies who were already looking for the exits. This was unsustainable even when oil prices were high. When oil prices collapsed, it became catastrophic. In 1980, oil was trading at over $35 per barrel, equivalent to $134 in today's money. By 1986, oil had collapsed to below $10 per barrel, just $29 in inflation-adjusted terms. That's a 75% collapse in oil prices in just 6 years. Why did prices collapse? Multiple factors converged perfectly to destroy Soviet revenues. The 1970s oil shocks had triggered energy conservation in Western countries. Non-OPEC production increased from new fields in the North Sea and Alaska. Economic slowdowns reduced global demand. And here's the part that was arguably deliberate. The Reagan administration convinced Saudi Arabia to maintain high production levels despite falling demand, explicitly to limit Soviet oil profits and pressure their economy. It worked devastatingly well. The Soviet Union's primary source of hard currency evaporated almost overnight. Oil exports that had generated massive revenues now brought in a fraction of what they had before. The Soviets tried exporting more oil just to maintain revenue levels, but they couldn't increase production fast enough. And here's where the death spiral really began. With oil revenues collapsing, the USSR couldn't afford to import food from the West. But Soviet agriculture was so inefficient that domestic production couldn't feed the population. Food shortages worsened throughout the 1980s. They also couldn't afford to import the Western machinery and technology needed to modernize their industrial base. So Soviet industry fell further behind Western competitors. Most critically, they couldn't service their Western debt. The hard currency that was supposed to cover debt payments simply wasn't there anymore. Western banks started getting nervous. Poland had already fallen behind on interest payments. Romania was struggling. Even the mighty Soviet Union was reportedly asking for grace periods on debt service. The lending enthusiasm of the 1970s completely reversed. Banks that had eagerly loaned to the Soviets now refused new credit. And without new loans, the Soviets couldn't even afford to make payments on old loans. This is the classic debt trap. When you're borrowing money just to pay interest on previous borrowing, you're in a debt spiral. And once creditors lose confidence and cut off new lending, the entire system collapses. But the Soviet leadership couldn't admit the severity of the crisis, because doing so would have undermined the entire communist narrative of economic superiority. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union was facing a full-blown economic crisis. Oil revenues had collapsed. Western banks had cut off credit. Food shortages were worsening. Industrial production was stagnating. And the only response the Soviet system knew was to print more rubles and pretend everything was fine. Budget deficits ballooned but were never officially recognized. The government just ordered state banks to transfer money directly to cover the shortfalls. Soviet citizens watched their savings grow but had nothing to spend it on. There were no consumer goods to buy. The black market economy grew to over 10% of the official GDP. Shortages and hoarding became normal life. The entire economic system was grinding to a halt. And then came Gorbachev. When Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary in March 1985, he understood that the Soviet system was failing. His goal was to reform and modernize the economy without abandoning socialism. He wanted to restore Soviet competitiveness with the West. So he launched two major reform programs, Glasnost and Perestroika. Glasnost meant openness, allowing more freedom of speech and press to foster dialogue and constructive criticism. Perestroika meant restructuring, introducing quasi-free market policies to government-run industries. But here's what Gorbachev didn't anticipate. Once you open the floodgates of criticism in a totalitarian system, you can't control what comes out. Glasnost was supposed to allow constructive criticism to improve the communist system. Instead, it became a tool for dismantling the system. The media began exposing decades of government lies, corruption, and failures. Democratic reform movements gained momentum throughout the Soviet bloc. Rather than a renaissance in communist thought, Glasnost destroyed whatever remaining legitimacy the Soviet system had. Perestroika was even worse. By introducing limited market mechanisms while keeping communist bureaucratic structures in place, Gorbachev created the worst of both systems. Some prices were liberalized while others remained controlled. Communist Party officials became black marketeers, using their positions to profit from the chaos. Wage hikes were funded by printing money, triggering an inflation spiral. The reforms that were supposed to save the Soviet economy accelerated its collapse instead. And throughout this entire crisis, the Soviets kept trying to borrow more money from the West. In 1987, the USSR requested observer status in GATT, the precursor to the World Trade Organization. In 1988, they signed a normalization agreement with the European Economic Community. They granted direct trading rights to select enterprises and established joint ventures with foreign companies. The message was clear. The Soviet Union was opening to Western markets and Western investment. They arranged export credits worth $5 to $6 billion from the UK, Germany, and Italy. They issued bonds in Western European markets. But Western banks weren't stupid. They could see the Soviet economy was imploding. Every new loan was riskier than the last. Credit that had flowed freely in the 1970s now came with much higher costs and stricter terms, if it came at all. The Soviets were trapped in an impossible contradiction. They needed to reduce imports to cut debt, but their population needed food and consumer goods. They needed to increase oil exports to earn hard currency, but oil prices were low and export infrastructure was limited. They needed Western technology to modernize, but they couldn't afford to buy it. Every solution to one problem made another problem worse. By 1989, the crisis was reaching its climax. The Soviet Union was running out of hard currency. Western banks were refusing new loans. The countries of Eastern Europe were breaking away from Soviet control. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. In 1990, the Baltic states declared independence. In August 1991, hardliners attempted a coup against Gorbachev, which failed but fatally weakened the central government. And on December 25, 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. The cascade of failures was breathtaking in its speed. Oil price collapse led to hard currency crisis. Hard currency crisis led to debt crisis. Debt crisis led to import cuts. Import cuts led to food shortages and industrial stagnation. Economic crisis led to political legitimacy collapse. Political reforms accelerated rather than prevented the disintegration. Within just a few years, one of the world's two superpowers simply ceased to exist. Now, here's where this story becomes relevant to every American watching this video. The United States is following a remarkably similar trajectory. We're not identical to the Soviet Union. Our economy is far more diverse and efficient. Our currency is globally dominant, and our political system is theoretically more adaptable. But the parallels are impossible to ignore. The Soviet Union went from 1.8 billion in debt to 31 billion in roughly 2 decades, a debt explosion that proved unsustainable when their primary revenue source collapsed. The United States went from 3.5 trillion in debt in 2001 to over 33 trillion today, a nearly tenfold increase in just over 2 decades. And unlike the Soviets, we're still accelerating our borrowing. Soviet military spending consumed 10 to 20% of GDP and diverted resources from productive uses. The Afghanistan war drained billions during an economic crisis. US military spending is only 3 to 4% of GDP, but in absolute terms, it exceeds the next 10 countries combined. The Middle East wars cost over $8 trillion with continued obligations stretching decades into the future. We maintain military commitments around the world that our economy increasingly struggles to support. The Soviet Union depended on Western banks for credit. When those banks lost confidence and cut off new loans, the system collapsed. The United States depends on foreign creditors, especially China and Japan, to buy our treasury bonds. China alone holds over $800 billion in US securities. If foreign appetite for US debt declines significantly, we'd face a crisis of Soviet proportions. The Soviet ruble was never internationally credible. When the USSR finally allowed free conversion, the exchange rate collapsed by 90%. The US dollar's reserve currency status has protected us so far, but massive debt accumulation threatens that status. Other nations are actively developing alternative payment systems through BRICS and other arrangements. If the dollar loses reserve status, America loses the ability to borrow indefinitely at low rates. Soviet economic statistics were deliberately manipulated to hide the true crisis until it was too late. The US ghost budget system has hidden the true costs of wars through emergency supplemental funding and off-budget accounting tricks. The full cost of Middle East wars, including future veterans' care and interest payments, was never included in official calculations. Soviet reforms came too late. When Gorbachev finally tried to change the system, the reforms destabilized rather than saved it. US fiscal reforms are desperately needed, but the political system seems incapable of making necessary changes. The military-industrial complex resists defense spending reform. Entrenched interests block meaningful budget discipline. Political polarization prevents consensus on solutions. The Soviet collapse surprised many observers because the true severity of the crisis was hidden until the end. When the collapse came, it happened fast. Could America face a similar sudden crisis with our debt levels, military overextension, dependency on foreign creditors, and political dysfunction? The question isn't whether we're at risk. The question is what will trigger the crisis. Now, there are important differences between the US and the USSR that give us advantages. The American economy is diverse and innovative, not dependent on a single commodity export. We have strong property rights, rule of law, and deep capital markets. Our dollar hegemony gives us enormous advantages that the Soviets never had. Our political system, despite its problems, allows for course corrections in ways the Soviet system never could. But here's what should worry you. Every empire in decline has thought their situation was different. The British didn't think they'd lose reserve currency status. The Soviets didn't think their system could collapse. Every dominant power assumes their advantages are permanent until suddenly they're not. The Soviet experience teaches us that even superpowers can fall when economic fundamentals are ignored. It teaches us that debt cannot grow faster than the economy forever. It teaches us that military overextension drains resources needed for productive investment. It teaches us that external shocks expose hidden vulnerabilities. It teaches us that reform windows eventually close. Most importantly, it teaches us that crisis can develop much faster than anyone expects. The Soviet Union went from superpower to dissolved nation in less than a decade once the crisis began in earnest. The United States still has time to avoid Soviet-style collapse. We still have the economic strength, technological capacity, and institutional flexibility to change course, but only if we make different choices than we're currently making. We need to restore fiscal discipline and budget transparency, end the ghost budget war financing that hides costs from democratic oversight, prioritize productive investment in infrastructure, education, and technology over endless military spending. Maintain the dollar's reserve currency status through responsible policy, reform the entrenched interests that have captured the political process for private profit. The Soviet collapse wasn't inevitable from the beginning. It resulted from specific policy choices that proved unsustainable when economic conditions changed. The Soviets borrowed too much, spent too much on military, depended too much on a single revenue source, and waited too long to reform. By the time they finally tried to change course, it was too late. The system was too rigid, the problems too deep, the creditors too skeptical. Gorbachev's reforms accelerated the collapse rather than preventing it. The United States faces different challenges, but eerily similar choices. We can continue on an unsustainable path of debt accumulation and military overextension until external shocks trigger a crisis we can't control. Or we can reform now, while we still have the strength and flexibility to manage the transition. The difference between those two paths is the difference between managed adjustment and chaotic collapse, between gradual reform and sudden crisis, between maintaining our position through adaptation and losing everything through rigidity. The Soviet Union chose wrong. They waited too long, reformed too little, and collapsed when the inevitable crisis arrived. The question for America is whether we'll learn from their mistake or repeat it. The debt spiral that brought down the Soviet Union wasn't unique to communism. It's a pattern that has destroyed empires throughout history: Rome, Spain, Britain, and now potentially the United States. Excessive military spending, unsustainable debt accumulation, dependency on external financing, loss of currency credibility, political paralysis preventing reform, and finally, an external shock that exposes all the hidden vulnerabilities at once. The Soviets' external shock was oil price collapse. What will America's be? A major recession? Interest rate spike? Loss of foreign creditor confidence? Geopolitical crisis? Or some combination we haven't imagined? We don't know when or what will trigger the crisis. But the vulnerabilities are building just like they did in the Soviet Union throughout the 1980s. And when the crisis comes, it will likely develop much faster than anyone expects. Just like it did for the Soviets. The Soviet Union existed for 69 years. For most of that time, it seemed permanent, powerful, and untouchable. Western analysts constantly underestimated Soviet strength and overestimated Soviet stability right up until the moment it didn't exist anymore. No empire lasts forever. The only question is whether the transition happens through managed reform or chaotic collapse. The United States is rich enough, strong enough, and flexible enough to choose managed reform. But only if we act while we still have that choice. The Soviet Union waited until they didn't have a choice anymore. And by then, it was too late. Thank you for watching my Money Mint.